because man's task is to make the earth after the model of heaven. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Man's project is to heavenize the earth. Man is made to transform the world from glory to glory, to take hold of it and break it down and remake it after the image of heaven.
Welcome back to the Reformed Reset. My name is Grant. Joined with me is my beautiful wife, Erica, the weaker vessel.
Hello, everyone.
And on this episode, guys, we have the great privilege of having Jason Farley on for an interview. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Awesome. We're really excited too. This is going to be fun. Guys, if you could please hit the subscribe button, the like button, the bell for notifications. Leave a comment. If you're in podcast world, subscribe and do all of those things there. It helps us get into the algorithm and helps YouTube suggest our video to new listeners, new watchers. So please do that if you want to support us. And down in the description below is handles for all our social media, our email, takeholdstudios@gmail.com, Patreon, the merch store, all of that stuff. Also links to all of the things that Jason is going to tell us he is involved in. And so we're going to put links to all of that stuff down below so that you can go check all of that as well. So make sure you go do that as you're listening to the show. I don't want to say any more of the business stuff. I want to get into this conversation because I'm really excited to have Jason on. Jason, do you mind just real quick before we jump into our topic, introducing yourself to the listeners and telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, happy to. So, my name's Jason Farley. I pastored for quite a while before God threw a left turn into my life and changed. It's like the Fire Nation attacked and everything changed. And I now work for Lore TV, LOOR.TV, as the content officer, going out and making sure that we can find the TV shows and movies that serve our audience well as work as a script writer and comedy writer, and then on the side, or it's really been at the center of my life, but it's on the side in terms of work right now. I've been studying philosophy, cosmology, historical development of ideas since before I ended up found myself in seminary, and that's sort of the heartbeat of everything that I do, is that historic kind of history of poetry and the ideas of cosmology and such. So
yeah, I think that's what Eric and I both benefit the most, at least listening to your content with the Chocolate Knox. So you guys need to go look up Choc Knox Unplugged with Jason Farley. They have their own YouTube channel. They release content every week, at least, maybe a little less than that at times, perhaps. But it's more long form. It is very valuable conversations, everybody. So a link to that will be in the description below, so you guys can go check out all of their episodes. It is fascinating, their conversations. It is really, really good. So that podcast is actually what really wanted, what made Eric and I really want you to come on. And in particular, we wanted to talk about cosmology and the church calendar. Now, before we jump into that, though, what's the difference between a worldview and a cosmology? Do you prefer one over the other? Do you think it really matters?
Well, worldview, the word worldview comes from the German philosophers that of the really the 19th century and the early 20th century, and the way that it has developed and Christians have used it tends to be the way you answer certain basic questions and how that ends up affecting the way you view everything. And the difficulty with it is it came out of a very rationalistic context, and so Christians have tended to use the word worldview in a rationalistic way. Here's the 6 parts of a worldview, and that here's the Christian answer versus other answers, that sort of thing. The reason that I like to use the word cosmology, which means your theory of kind of the unity of all things, or your theory of what kind of place this is that we live in, what kind of story we're in, what kind of world we find ourselves in. The reason I prefer that is mostly just because it is the more historic. It's an older word for what became worldview studies, and it's something that opens you up to the possibility that there are that Christians in other eras have answered some of these questions in different ways. So it helps expand kind of the imaginative possibilities. Modern people tend to have very thin imaginations where there's certain questions that are really important. When you talk to people and they say, well, do you lean right or do you lean left? And you think, well, those are really all the options that we've got for politics, is leaning one direction or leaning the other direction, but our feet are all basically in the same spot. That same sort of way, we've used worldview in a similar sort of way. And so I like to use cosmology just because I think it's a bigger, broader concept, and because that's what we used to call it before the German worldview philosophers came along. I think they've been helpful, and worldview Christianity and worldview studies has been helpful. Sure. But there's a bigger, broader conversation that's been going on, all the way back to what, as the oldest writings called cosmology, that I would rather see us enter into that aspect of the human conversation.
Do you think so? If someone embraces cosmology, would you add any other adjectives to it? Or do you think it would be necessary Christian cosmology, or even something? I know there was some people that would probably love to have a reformed cosmology or Calvinistic cosmology. What would you say to that?
Yeah, well, I think this is one of the reasons I like the term cosmology, is because cosmology is one of the things that everybody, all of the Christians agreed upon. It didn't matter if you were Lutheran or Reformed or Roman Catholic. Everybody at that time agreed upon a certain cosmology, and that was that God created the world in 6 days. That the world was directed and overseen by God, and that it was a place perfectly designed for the kind of creatures we are to rule over, right? So that was the stuff everybody agreed on. What they disagreed on was the relationship between worship between for example, the sacraments and salvation, right? They disagreed on that relationship, but they agreed on the cosmological questions, and that's because they were all living in a fundamentally Christian society, right? Now you have the beginnings of the modernist cosmology has begun to sneak in through a philosopher named Niccolo Machiavelli in Florence, and he's beginning to put forward a materialistic cosmology, a power-based cosmology, where you don't have you don't have natures, and so really there's a power system holding reality in its particular shape, and but it doesn't have a nature. You've got a nihilistic metaphysic that he begins putting forward, meaning that things are defined by what they aren't, not by what they are. They don't have a nature themselves, but that, say that this thing is a chair because it's not a table, it's not, it's not everything else. So it functions as a chair, not because it has, because it exists with its own nature as a chair, right? So you begin having that starts in Machiavelli in the 15th century. But one of the elders in in Calvin's church wrote a book called Against Machiavelli in Calvin's day. They're already starting to say, hey, look out for that. That's dangerous stuff. But Machiavelli eventually becomes the Enlightenment. He's, kind of the grandfather of the Enlightenment, of modernism, and eventually of Marxism, and of all the different kinds of socialism. Anything that says that the world has a limited number of resources and everybody, and there's a fundamental rivalry over those resources. Well, that's a Machiavellian cosmology, whereas everybody agreed that we lived in a world created by God that was a good fit for creatures like us, that we weren't an invader, we weren't going to run out of resources, but that it was a good fit. So the term, so I don't think we need a specifically reformed cosmology, because but although I do think that the different sacramental understandings do breed different cosmologies in the long run. I mean, you see over the years that when a group, when a culture embraces a sacramental theology, that they are embracing a particular direction for their cosmology to go. So I do think that there are different cosmologies embedded in the sacramental actions and the way we do them, but that's a different discussion. So I don't think we need a reformed cosmology, but I do think a reformed sacramental theology does restore over time within a culture a proper cosmology.
Gotcha. No,
it was a big answer.
That's good, because I think maybe somebody who would want to emphasize the reformed part of it would just want to ensure that the sovereignty of God over that world that he's created, and not some kind of synergistic or other understanding maybe. But you are right. That is a deep conversation we could probably have, and not what we intended for today. I want to know how that cosmology then produces something like the church calendar, and what's the relationship there?
Yeah. So what's really interesting is the way that right now the attack, or a central way that the imagination of the next generation is being discipled away from Christianity, is by means of an attempt to completely hijack the calendar, right? So we're right at the end of Black History Month, for example, right? That's an addition to the calendar. And I believe, and then I think we go into like Asian and Pacific Islanders Month, and we go into, then you have LGBTQ calendar time, right? And the reason that it's being put on and for me at least, when I first saw Black History Month added to the calendar, I thought, man, that's strange. Yeah. I don't understand what that is about. Why would that doesn't, what is it that we're celebrating? Because it's not an event that has happened in the past that we're celebrating, but it's it's the vague generalities of the history of a particular people group within American society. So it's a strange way to use the calendar. If you look at it historically, what kind of things go on there, unless you think of the calendar in a religious way, right? So when you look at a calendar that develops over time within a people, there are different things that you have. You have memorials, you have memorials, you have holidays, you have seasons, and you have saints' days, right? Those are really what gives a calendar its shape. So the traditional the traditional kind of general calendar of Western Christianity, it has Advent leading up to Christmas, and then you have Epiphany, and then you have Lent leading up to Good Friday, and Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter, And you have, depending on where you are, you'll have Trinity Sunday. You'll have different things that are holidays, right? Or days,
right.
holy days, which means days that are set apart for a particular purpose. And they also function like memorials. But the memorials on the American calendar would be things like Thanksgiving, Memorial Day, Veterans Day, right? Days where you set aside to remember the acts of people that have done something, or important days throughout our history in the past. And then, seasons that have to do with kind of larger periods of time set aside for either preparations or celebrations, that sort of thing. Well, what's happened is, as you can't have a neutral calendar, and as the church has given up its authority over the calendar and given the authority of the calendar over to the secular sphere more and more and more, the secular sphere has embedded into has come to embed into the calendar a secular vision for which things the calendar should be memorializing.
Right.
So, and so, you have something like, Black History Month is a way of trying to embed into the calendar a racial animosity that used to exist, and they'll tell you, oh, this has existed for all time and for all eternity, but you really didn't have racial animosity before races were invented, right? Races were invented at the end of the 1700, early 1800, and then Darwinism really gives us the final shape of races, and you start to get racism based on this new concept of biological and evolutionary racial differences between people groups, right? Well, so something like Black History Month is a way of saying we need to memorialize that there has been in the past this racial animosity, that this and put it on the calendar, and as a way of I depending, different people are using it in different ways, because sometimes it's a way of saying, let's never let that happen again. And I think that's what the people that probably originally came up with the idea had. But it turns out that memorializing something that was evil has a terrible effect on the culture over time, because then it becomes a yearly reminder of the animosity. So instead of memorializing something that was a good thing, it memorializes something that keeps the rivalry alive, right? And fundamentally, the understanding of an evolutionary world is that rivalry is the mechanism that moves us forward. Rivalry is the mechanism that the world is built on, and so the memorializing rivalry makes complete and perfect sense in an evolutionary understanding of the human race, right? So, but now we're adding in all these different saints' days, and secular saints' days, secular memorials, to make sure that we never forget the rivalry, right? Because rivalry is at the heart of it. Well, the Christian calendar has had the exact opposite effect, right? Because you're memorializing the destruction of the rivalry between man and God. It wasn't a rivalry from God's side, but we tried to turn it into a rivalry, right? And then the destruction of the rivalry between man and man, right? So throughout history, you have things like World War II taking a pause for Christmas, right? Like the world's at war, but then it's Christmas Day, and so everybody says, except for we all know that really this rivalry is not ultimate, and that the incarnation of exactly. So because it's memorializing those moments throughout history where God acted on behalf of the human race. So Christmas, when God when the Prince of Peace arrives, right? The governments are going to be upon his shoulders, and he's going to bring peace to the world, right? The Epiphany, the moment when the first Jews come into the new kingdom, right? The first Jews trust in Jesus. There were the Gentiles, excuse me, the first Gentiles come into the new kingdom, right? There were Gentile conversions throughout the Old Testament, but you didn't have the mass the mass entrance of Gentiles. So Epiphany is the memorial of that, right? Easter is the memorial of the final death of death, the final death of sin, the final death of rivalry between man and God. And so the Christian calendar has had the effect of bringing people together, which is why you see that the heretics in the first few hundred years of the church, one of the things that they wrestle with the church over is they want control of the calendar, because they know that they can change it. So which is why calendar questions end up in the Nicene Creed, in the long versions of the Nicene Creed, is they're making decisions about the calendar because the heretics wanted control of the calendar. It's a way of settling who actually, which kind of world you live in. So there's that view. The calendar is always telling you what kind of story you're really in, and pointing you forward towards a particular future. And so as the church has given up the calendar, it's basically said, we don't know or believe that there's any particular future coming. We don't believe Jesus is really the Lord of time in any significant way. Even though it's in some of our greatest hymns, Jesus is the potentate of time, and we've kind of given that all over to the secular world, because the church has retreated into what we think of as religious space, or space in our head, or maybe space in our heart, depending on where it is, and has given up that view that we've been actually given dominion over the calendar and time and the future that God is bringing to pass.
So if a church,
did that answer your question?
that was fantastic. And I have a couple more here that will perfectly relate to it. I love the sort of take dominion view of calendar is just part of fulfilling the cultural mandate of taking dominion, and then ordering our lives around these great events that are obviously far more important than any other events that have happened, period. So why because I kind of want to talk about some of the evangelical cat and water reaction to the calendar. You often get you're playing dress up church, or whatever, but then a lot of those churches are doing Father's Day sermons, or they're doing Mother's Day sermons,
or 4th of July services,
or 4th of July, or other things, and it's like, who told you to celebrate that holiday? Mm-hmm. Who told you to do that?
Yeah, the Hallmark stores. That's who made up Mother's Day. So
so who's so you do have a church calendar, but you're not listening to scripture to create your calendar.
I think what it is the modern American secularism and modernism disdains the past, right? But it hasn't been good for culture or for the psyche of people. Right? You have all of these people who feel dislodged from reality. They don't have any real connection, I've been saying for a while, hey, if you keep calling everything racist, you're going to create racists, right? Because the way that it works is, if somebody is fighting to dislodge you more and more and more, you're going to start you're going to start using their categories and trying to grab the opposite of of the people that you start to think of as the bad guys, right? But I mean, that's a modernist way of doing it, right? It's a rivalrous way of defining yourself over against your enemy. But that's exactly in Aristotle's Politics. That's exactly how he says a community is formed. When there's an enemy, people will only hold together when there's an enemy that they can only defeat if they're together, right? So that's Aristotle's political ethics, right? He says when there's a big enemy that we can't defeat on our own, then we'll join together with the people around us, and that is what creates the city, right? And so he calls us a political animal because we need cities to be able to defeat the kind of enemies that we find in the world. Whether it's weather, I can't just grow enough food on my own. There needs to be a whole community to be able to grow enough food and fight off the weather, whether it's that or the armies of other nations, or if you think of like the Eskimos that need a whale to exist, they have to work together, right? And that's what creates community, Aristotle says. But if that's the case, if that is the way non-Christian communities are formed, if you want to create a bunch of little sub communities, then the best thing to do is attack, and that's what we've seen happen for the last 60 years, 50 years probably. And so you're starting to see an uptick in white supremacy and that sort of thing. Maybe, I don't know. That's what they say. It could all be feds. Who knows? But you also have, but Christianity comes at it from a completely different way of building community, right? You're gathered around a common love, right? A common love for Christ, and then a common and then that produces love for the brethren, right? And then the community actually grows out of that love, where it says the Holy Spirit knits us together in love. So instead of that that opposite approach, that really is the only thing that I think that's the thing that that the modern church has to get away from, right? Because right now, so much of what we define ourselves as is not Roman Catholic, right? We're evangelical, so we're not Roman Catholic. We are opposed to the church in the past, the medievals, whatever it is, whatever they did over there on the one hand, and then the secularists on the other. And so we try to say we are the ones that aren't the secularists, and we're not the Roman Catholics, and you end up with tiny little subgroups which hold, because you're defined by who you're against. You get tiny little subgroups that don't get along with one another because they're defined nihilistically, defined by what they're not, and so they can't get along with people that aren't exactly like them. Well, the church, the historic church calendar, the historic church, the historic way of approaching is God in history has done these things for us. He's sent his son. His son has died for us. 3 days later, the Holy Spirit in history raised Jesus from the dead, and that changed the authority structure of the world. Right. And so now we live in a different authority structure. And so in the Old Testament, the calendar was set by the sun, the moon, and the stars. That's where the authority for the calendar was. In the New Testament, Jesus sits at the right hand of God above the stars, and he sets the calendar. And he does that by drawing us to himself and making us shine like stars in the sky. And then, so Colossians is a whole section on the calendar is now under your authority, not over you. The calendar is under you, not over you. So quit judging each other, right? So he's talking about the divisions within the church are solved by coming to understand that we are over the calendar, not under the calendar, right? That it's a very so all of the fracturing of the evangelical church and the nihilistic self-definition Paul says is a cosmology problem. You're trying, and what he says is you're trying to live under the old system still.
Yep.
And living under the old system causes a bunch of tiny divisions within the church.
Yeah.
Whereas the new system has one head, which is Christ. It has one authority, which is Christ. All authority in heaven and earth has been given to Christ. And then that authority is for the church. Colossians says, right? That's and then the church as his body is drawn up into that authority over the sun, the moon, and the stars, the authority over the calendar system. And that is, according to Paul, that's a point of broader unity that we hold together on, because he says, you're going to say, I'm of Apollos, I am of Paul. You're going to have those, I'm of Cephas, right? You're going to have those issues. But when we come together under the authority of Christ in a cosmological sense, right? Then we find that we can have unity while we work out the details, right? And that's what Paul is talking about in that section is how to have unity while you work out the details, because he makes it really clear. Like, some of you are celebrating the Sabbath on Saturday and some on Sunday. Some of you are still eating kosher. Some of you are not. You've got all of these issues that they're going to have to work through. Mm-hmm. But he says, this is how you have unity in the meantime, is understand Christ's authority over everything, right? And then the authority that we have by being in Christ is over those. In that cosmological setting, it's over those powers and authorities, not under them. So I think that there's this deep compromise on cosmology that has made the divisions within the church seem normal. When the unloving stance that we hold towards one another to seem normal, but really what that is it's a functional atheism. It's a functional return to the ancient system that says we're all rivals and we're defined by our enemies, rather than being gathered to Christ and defined by our love of Christ and our love for one another, right? Which is what the love of Christ looks like. Because he says, how can you say you love Christ without loving one another? So, was that too roundabout of a way to answer your question? You've listened to the show, so I don't have it. It's hard to walk in straight lines sometimes.
I love it. That's why I just sit here. I never do interviews when Grant does podcasts. He always does them by himself, but I was like, I'm going to do this one. Because I just want to sit here and I just want to listen, and I probably won't say anything, but I want to listen to this one. But I love it. So basically it's Machiavellian, like you were saying. That's the problem.
Yeah, it is. And I think you see it when you see it in when our communities are not justified or made right or showed to be right with God by faith, but it's by some other means, right? By being better than that group, or not like that group, or opposing to that group, whatever it is. When we start defining ourselves by works rather than by faith as a community, right? When our communal justification is by works and not by faith, the temptation is going to be to slip in straight into a Machiavellianism, that it's a power structure, that it's a power system, rather than saying, look, if we trust God, believe his promises and follow him, then there's no Red Sea that can stop us, right? Red Sea's part in front of us. Water comes from rocks. You find man in the wilderness, right? You can be, like Psalm 23 says, that you can be surrounded by your enemies and you'll still find a table set by God right there in the wilderness. But that's because that's the kind of people, that's the kind of people we are, right? We are Christ's people. We are a walking garden, no matter what wilderness we're in. And so the world sprouts into a garden around us, right? I mean, though it says that the waters of life flow from our bellies wherever we go, right? It's an understanding of who we are, that Christ loved us, put his name on us, put his spirit within us. That means that we are a walking Garden of Eden wherever the church goes, wherever the church gathers. It's a fundamentally different understanding of what kind of place this is, what kind of world this is, so that we aren't, in order to develop, I guess, I don't know, a vaccine against Machiavellianism. You say vaccine in a positive way anymore? I'm not sure.
I don't know. Probably not. Probably not.
So
Yeah,
this
probably
might
not.
Probably not.
This is like a tangential question then. How do you get like your kids, like you were talking about earlier, how do you form their imaginations? And like even in a more specific sense, how do you get your kids to understand symbols and understand words? And because I feel like Christians do a terrible job of that. We are so literal, and it often goes back to the, well, show me in the Bible exactly where it says that. And if you can't, then get it out of here.
And you're a heretic.
Right.
Although I try to be constantly quoting the scriptures, right? Like,
Sure.
So
yeah.
that
Sure.
I think that the problem, I think the problem is we don't let the Bible do the speaking, right? We're like, show me in the Bible, and you say, well, it says that right here, and then we say, yeah, but that's not what that means. We're like, no, let the Bible. We need to let the Bible do the speaking, and let the Bible actually communicate the way it communicates, in a transformative way. So when you've got Psalm 119, it says, meditate on the law. We're like, oh, but except for the law is a bad thing. So I'm not going to let I'm not going to let the Bible talk, set the terms of the discussion. Right. But then because the law is the kind of thing that turns us into wise people by meditating on it. Right. So anyway, with kids, I think this is a really, really important part of it. And this is something I learned from my wife really early on, is if you, our job as parents is to be as good of a parent as we can be, but also to be growing as a Christian as much as we can. Right. So, and if we are doing that in front of our kids, then our kids, they draft with us, as we are growing in the Lord, with the idea that they're launching in the direction that we're going, right? Because they're so a big part of it is as you're learning and growing and changing, is to be doing that in front of your kids and open about it. I used to believe this, but now I believe this. The Bible corrected me here, and being able to go to your kids and say, when you guys were young and I was this is really what I thought we should do, and now I've learned this, and please forgive me for or I'll pay for your therapy, whatever it is. Right. But so I think the beginning of it is just learning that our authority doesn't flow from being right all the time, right? Our authority is ours by faith, right? It's our authority over our kids' lives is not something that we earn because we're bigger and stronger or righter or know more, right? Our authority is something that's given to us by God, and then we're supposed to use it in a way that blesses our kids. And so, Psalm 130 says that the way to be respected is to be forgiving, right? That when we forgive, that forgiveness exchange, that when we are repenting to our kids, asking for forgiveness, when we're showing them how to be forgiving, how to forgive by being forgiving, by setting their sin aside when they ask for forgiveness and forgetting it, the way God does, that's actually the way to respect. The Psalm 130 tells us, right? So I think it's a matter of learning the kind of world that God has made, and then trying to live according to it, which is a thing that you do by faith. So that's I think the heart of it. And then reading the kinds of books and the kinds of poetry and really discipling your kids' imagination with stories, which is the way God disciples our imagination. I mean, so he does it with a number of things, but one of them, so he does it with law and story and poetry and song and history and all sorts of things. But finding the kind of books that really do that and help with that, I just yesterday morning, I was picking up an old book that I'd read a bunch when I was in elementary school, and it was a book on King Arthur by Roger Lancelin Green, and I just read this book. I loved it, and I just realized yesterday that he was an inkling, that that every week he was drinking beer with C.S. Lewis, right? For years.
No wonder.
I was like, oh my gosh, this book was so formative for my understanding of what it meant to be a man, right? The King Arthur, that King Arthur, the Arthurian legends, right? He took them and he did the same thing for the Greek legends. He took which are the ones that how it should form a Christian's imagination, and he put together these books of collections of these ancient stories retold for kids.
Yeah.
Hugely influential on my life, as well as Narnia was, The Lord of the Rings was, Beowulf was really big for me as a kid. And those ones, those discipled my imagination long before I became a Christian. I was 17 when I actually finally was baptized, right? I didn't grow up going to church, but those books were discipling my imagination towards a Christian understanding of the world, so that I could understand Jesus died for you, even though I didn't know what that meant, but I knew what it meant for the knights to serve Arthur, and that to me was central to my understanding of what it meant to become a disciple of Jesus. Just because those were the category, that was always what I had always wanted. The only thing I ever wanted was to be a knight in some elvish princess's
Of course.
I wanted a queen more than anything, not just to be able to honor, right? So I'd read that stuff, and I just thought, right, right, and then but I had just given up, right? Like around the 6th grade, 7th grade, I just gave up. That world doesn't exist anymore, and that's sad. But now you have to live in this Machiavellian universe, and just declared myself an atheist and became very cynical. And because of the things that I had grown to love, I didn't think were possible. That was the year I had said I always wanted to be Christopher Columbus. He was a hero of mine. I'd read all of his journals, as well as Lewis and Clark. I'd read all of Lewis and Clark's journals, and and then somebody told me, we're done exploring now, and I was like, oh, well, what do I even exist for then?
Worst friend ever.
Right? Yeah, it was a teacher. That's the worst part. It was a teacher. We're done exploring now. So eventually, I got into space. I was
there.
Now
you go. I
want to. Yeah, exactly. But I think that discipling your kids' imagination with good stories like Narnia, Lord of the Rings are both really good. All the stuff by the Inklings is really good. But there's a lot of that. I mean, I personally, my family spent a lot of time at Hogwarts. Right? We read Narnia. We read the Harry Potter, and we talked about it a lot. And that was one of the ways that I taught them how to read and see echoes, read and see character development, read and see every time Harry goes through has to fight Voldemort, he does it either underground or in a cemetery, because it's a sacrifice. It's a death that he has to go through, and talked through all those things and sort of use that as a central way to teach them how to read literature. So because there's any book that's good, it's because it functions in that kind of universe. So
how I want to add, so you mentioned a bunch of resources that could help develop that imagination for kids. Before I get to the other question of how the church calendar can be sort of a weapon that church needs to use against secular humanism, the communism, all this stuff that's coming after the church. Before we get to that question, because I think that would be a really like boots on the ground way to actually apply something like church calendar isn't just to decorate your church. Like it actually is. Is there a resource book or something? It could be a classic book that you, for adults, like, hey, you want to really start to maybe you're late to the game, but you're a reader and you're just like, I want to be able to develop this taste for what you're talking about. Is there anything you'd recommend?
Well, it depends on where you're starting, because when I go to a bookstore, I go to the young readers section first. To this day, because I think that's where a lot of the best stuff is. So, Louis Sachar Holes is a really good place to start. It's basically it's one of the best stories that about how generational curses can be broken by messianic sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's all about being the first Elia Yelnats and the original Elia Yelnats and the new Elia Yelnats, right? Like you've got this first Adam, second Adam thing that is going on in the story, right? It's so that's actually, I usually tell people to start with Holes and read it a couple of times and try and see if you can find the Christian themes in there, because it's such a great book, right? But if you're looking something that's really aimed more at adults, that Peter Beagle's The Last Unicorn is a really good spot to begin. The C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces and the Space Trilogy are aimed at adults. I think Till We Have Faces is the greatest novel of the 20th century.
It's my favorite.
It really is. And then there's a lot in Tolkien that's fantastic. But if you really want to dig in, the great medieval poets in the English tradition, you've got Beowulf, Chaucer, Milton, are really great. Chaucer, I think, he's one of my all-time favorites. But people are surprised and that a Christian could write what he writes sometimes, because he writes comedies and he writes serious stuff. He writes high royal stuff. He writes knights and ladies stuff. And then he'll write, one of his stories is he's I don't know, probably a 2,500 word long fart joke, and if you don't see it coming, you just think but it's deeply Christian. All of it is,
and he rhymes it. He rhymes beautifully.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's gorgeous writing. But he is, and then the entire book is organized around the zodiac, which now the only people that really talk about the zodiac are astrologers. But back then, if you walked, the zodiac it's the constellations that the sun passes through, and it's how you know what time of the year it is, right? It was the way that you marked out the months back then. And so it's not, but they saw the zodiac as telling the story of Jesus's coming, right? They saw the zodiac as something that was kind of the gospel in the sky, the gospel in the stars. So he organizes the whole thing around the central theme of the story that the zodiac is telling. He died before it was finished, but so it's deeply Christian. But then outside of the English tradition of literature, you have and then Shakespeare, I think, he's the greatest writer in modern English, right? And it is worth all the time you spend with him. And but outside that, you have Dante in Italian, who in a lot of ways, he's the beginning of the Reformation. He's one of the first, after the Pope in the 12th century has claimed a new level of authority and power that leads to the Great Schism and all of that. Dante is the first one to put forward an argument against papal the papal grasp for power. But then he writes in a very thoughtful Christian way about how to live well in the world that God made. You have the Inferno is an allegorical understanding of the things that keep people from following Jesus, from becoming a Christian. So it's sort of a book of apologetics, but psychological, the psychological things that we tell ourselves to keep us from Jesus. He tries to break those down and reveal them. And then the Purgatorio is all of the things that keep us from growing as Christians. So he tries to break down the lies we tell ourselves that keep us back from living the full Christian life. And then the Paradiso is him trying to show how the beauty, this is from Augustine, that the beauty of Christ is the converting power. When we come to see the beauty of Christ within our imagination and the way that God has built the world and acted within the world, that's the power behind all conversion and sanctification, is the shifting to understanding the beauty of Christ. So Augustine called it the reordering or the proper ordering of our loves.
Right. Yeah.
Any time that you spend with Dante is incredibly valuable. And there's a brand new Joseph Carlson just put out a new translation that's really good. I'm halfway through the Purgatorio right now and enjoying it. But his introductions, he's a Baptist pastor, and his introductions are really helpful to help evangelicals understand why time with Dante is valuable, and because he's a Baptist pastor and really, and then a really great poet. So his translation's really good too.
That's awesome. Cool. So yeah, final question. I know we got you just for a few more minutes, but so we want to implement this church calendar, and we have a good proper understanding of the cosmology. Now, further, like, why is this such an effective weapon the church needs to take hold of?
Well, here's a good example. So I have a cousin who's a pastor now, who he grew up in a fundamentalist context where they didn't celebrate Halloween. And he said, I just sat there every Halloween. I sat there in my house with the lights off, wishing that I wasn't a Christian. But now he never turned away from the Lord. He never, he served, he's served the Lord his whole life, and now he's a pastor. He's a wonderful pastor. Yeah. But he said they were having more fun than me, and I knew, and so I thought they were getting something that was being held back from me by Jesus. So one day a year, I didn't like being a Christian, and but that description of jealousy. Right, jealousy for what they have that we don't have. Deuteronomy connects that to both the justice that we get and the calendar. Right, Deuteronomy connects that to, you have a God that's so close to you that your holy days, the calendar that you're given and the laws that you're given are going to make the nations jealous. Right, well. So I think that's where you start, is you say, which of these things can we do so well that our kids are going to brag about it to all their friends? Oh my gosh, you don't get to do Epiphany. You don't light your Christmas trees on fire and blow things up on Epiphany like we get to. Whatever the thing is, what is it that you start with? Whichever one, if we celebrate this, our kids are going to brag about it to all their friends, right? And everybody's going to be jealous that they don't get to be a part of this celebration. And I think that's just, that's what we want our dinner tables to be. That's what we want our church services to be. That's what we want all of the celebratory aspects of our life to be that way. I think that's how you implement. You start by saying, which of the holidays can we celebrate in that sort of way? And things like Epiphany and Good Friday, those are ones that the world doesn't really have. Like they might get Easter, they might have Christmas, but they don't have Epiphany. And if you're blowing your Christmas tree up with gasoline, and that sort of thing, then the kids are going to be like, what do you mean you don't get to celebrate Epiphany? Right. And that nobody, especially men, they never grow out of that. Right. That's something that we always have. So I think thinking in terms of how, what can we celebrate? What do we get to celebrate that the rest of the world doesn't? I think it's a revolutionary way of understanding, and that's the reality of the cosmology that we live in a world where God's love is overflowing so significantly, and that it's beyond what we can say thank you for. We can't say thank you fast enough, often enough to actually respond properly to the amount of love and grace that God pours on us constantly through the Holy Spirit, by means secured for us by the death of Christ on the cross and the resurrection by the Holy Spirit, and then poured onto us by the continued presence and eternal pouring of the Holy Spirit onto us. So we've got things to celebrate that we can never encapsulate, which is why I'm grateful that the church calendar gets to go on for eternity, I think. But
that's awesome.
So that's how I would approach it.
No, that's great. That's really, really good. Do you have anything else?
I mean, I feel like we could talk for another hour and ask questions, but I know that we can't. So
yeah, I hate to end our time now. I know we could just keep chatting about this and really go into some detail.
That's so helpful, though.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Jason. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'll let you know when this comes out. And everybody, please go subscribe and listen to Chalk Knox Unplugged with Jason Farley. Again, the link is down below. You will be blessed, I promise. So until next time, guys, take hold and reorder creation by first reforming your home. This has been the Reformed Reset.
But on the basis of grace and on the finished work of Jesus Christ, the project is back and forth, and the destiny of a new transformed world is assured.
I just put the sourdough in the oven too, so I've got like 40 minutes.